It setting up. Obviously, I've been making pots for probably over 50 years now, and the sort of marketplace and the whole scene of setting up and making and marketing your ware has changed considerably over those years. I suppose the biggest change really is things like the internet and Instagram as means of marketing your work. But behind that, there's still the actual logistics of setting up your individual business and how you go about that. For the majority of situations where you look at somebody who's wanting to set up, the thing that's probably come to mind more than anything else is that very often people aren't actually both physically and skill-wise prepared for the sort of marketplace. That is, they set the business up sometimes with very little idea of what is physically involved with making, producing, and moving the items, the product, whatever it is that you're making to the customer. And I'll give you an example. Quite a long time ago, probably nearly 30 years ago, we were approached by John Lewis Partnership, and we were making a range of quite expensive, exclusive stoneware, wood-fired, sort of salt-glazed gardenware. And John Lewis were very interested in actually marketing this product for us. And we were really keen, but extremely concerned that they would ask us to actually produce more than we were physically capable of. There was only myself and my ex-apprentice, who then became my business partner, but I was also at the time lecturing at De Montfort University in Leicester. So we went to them and said, look, yeah, we would love to take on this opportunity, but we have concerns as to whether we would be able to produce enough to satisfy your demands. And they said, no, that's absolutely no problem. You tell us what you can make and what your terms are, and we will do the best we can to facilitate that. After that, they said, actually, our main concern is whether you can actually deliver what you promise. And we said, well, what do you mean? And they said, we have for many years tried to work with potters and craftspeople, and on every single occasion, they've let us down. We place an order, we give them a delivery time and date, and the goods fail to turn up. And we said, well, how do you mean? He said, well, we have, because we're such a massive, business concern, we have delivery times and dates that are literally down to a 15-minute window. So our delivery date, we would make maybe something like 7 pallets of gardenware, and they had to be delivered to the Milton Keynes depot by 2:30 to 2:45 on a Friday afternoon on a given date. And if it was late, the order was cancelled, and then the goods would be rejected, and then you'd go round again, and they would reorder it and give you a new delivery date. And I think this is something that people sometimes don't get to grips with when they're dealing with a larger customer. And of course, if you want your sort of business to grow, very often, these larger companies will come to you very recently, and until I got more and more involved with the setting up and running of Clay College, I did a lot of work for Nando's restaurants, large ceramic lighting and various restaurants. And again, they had talked to many, many potters up and down the UK, offering them extremely lucrative contracts to produce ceramics. And in fact, a friend of mine, Rich Miller, who from the Throwdown, was one of the he's now one of the presenters, but was the on-screen technician. He does a lot of tile work for them. But again, you have very specific sort of times to produce the work and deliver. And I did a big contract for Nando's restaurant in Manchester. And again, it had to be delivered on November the 5th at 10:15 to the Manchester restaurant. And you have to produce the goods and deliver them and make sure they're there. So many people are not really cut out to work to such constraints. Obviously, there's a little bit more leeway with sort of smaller shops and galleries and things. But I think if you're going into this, whichever way we sort of look at it, at the end of the day, we're creatives, but the funny part about it is that it's also a business. And I think that's the part we sort of try and tend to ignore. But many opportunities are presented to makers, and maybe sometimes through fear or sometimes a reluctance to take on a sort of more business approach to maybe a contract to produce something. They would prefer to, go to shows or deal with galleries, which is a little bit more sort of flexible. Actually, physically setting up, that's changed dramatically. I mean, when I started, very early 70s, the first studio I worked in was in the Cheshire countryside. It was a beautiful black and white Tudor farmhouse, and the outbuildings had been converted into a studio, and it was all the things that you would think of as an idyllic studio, sort of pottery, producing domestic stoneware and porcelain. And we had a massive 250 cubic foot oil-fired kiln. So that's something that's quite rare today. The majority of makers, when they're setting up, they're thinking, well, where am I going to operate from? And many of the people that I know now are really thinking, can I afford a separate workshop? Can I afford the overheads that go along with that? And particularly when you're starting out, in ceramics, it's not one of the most expensive businesses to set up with. But of course, there are amounts of money involved, potter's wheels, kilns, machinery and equipment, slab rolling machines, whatever it is, that have to be bought before you can start. And of course, most of us have been trained through art school, college, whatever, and all those items are there for the use. When you set up, you've got to think, how much money have I got? Can I afford these objects? Do I buy new? Do I buy second hand? Do I buy a kiln? Do I build a kiln? The majority of people, I think now, setting up will probably work from home and, work out of a garden shed or a garage, or I even know people who work out of, their back bedroom. A friend of mine, he has a corner in the kitchen, and he's got his kiln in the kitchen as well, but he's able to operate on a very, very low overhead. And that means he can do the shows and he can go out to the markets, and he's not spending his money on rents and overheads. I was in a situation a few years ago when I had my workshop in the Rosslyn Works next to the Gladstone Pottery Museum, and I paid a fairly low rent there because my studio was also open to the public. People could come in and watch me working, and the apprentices that were working with me. So, but then the council, in its infinite wisdom, increased the rent to a point where it was no longer sustainable. And so I moved my operation back to my home. I was very lucky because when we bought this property, I had this in mind, and we bought a property that had got outbuildings, and I moved the operation into there. But again, not everybody is in a position to sort of go out and buy property that's got outbuildings. And this is why many people, as I say, work from home and keep their overheads to an absolute minimum if possible. A lot of, because obviously, you know, I'm a potter, I can't speak for different crafts. But the one thing that I've come across so often, and in many circumstances, I've actually helped these people out, is that we train at art school. You do a degree in ceramics or whatever it is, but actually that is not training you to be a maker, a producer. And so I personally, after 4 years at art school, then spent another 3 years as basically an apprentice making in studios to learn this sort of studio skills and crafts and increase my productive skills, and then working in industry on the technical side for 3 years to increase my sort of technical knowledge. Many people now are moving immediately from education into setting up a business, and find it extremely difficult to make that sort of transition between sort of college making and production. And this is something I would sort of recommend to anybody, if they possibly can, is if you can work alongside somebody or with somebody, even if it's only for a short period, is to get some idea of what it's like to be in a studio and see the level of production, how it sort of flows through the system, and even down to, you know, things like packaging and dispatching, and the sort of the more boring side of business. You know, the fun bit is the making, but there are a lot of other things sort of involved. I mean, most people when they're setting up, you know, and I've only done it on a few occasions, but, you know, developing some form of business plan, some sort of idea of what you want to do, where you want to go, and how you're going to fund this. You know, very often with young graduates, it's sort of bank of mum and dad who help set up. But I've also seen that situation where that has happened, and it's not necessarily the best thing, because I've seen where people have been supported, and they help them get a studio set up, they help them with the machinery and equipment, but they don't actually have a product or a process where whatever it is they are going to make can go through the system, be produced, and come out the other end. So once that assistance is withdrawn, they fail fairly quickly. The other thing is, I would never ever recommend anybody to try and chase the market. That is, trying to produce something that they think somebody wants. With the students at Clay College, what we try and do is we try and encourage them to be individuals. We try and develop them as makers so that they can produce, but we try and explain to them that you, as an individual maker, you don't need a massive amount to keep you going. And if you produce something, there is somebody, or there are people out there who will like what you make. How do you get it out there, though? This is the problem. And I suppose the traditional way would have been to do the shows, you know, the Hatfields, the clay art, art and action, all these sort of places. What's the one at Penrith? Potfest in the Pens, Potfest in the Park, these sort of things. But again, you have to treat these as speculative, because you could be making something and it's of a very high quality and very desirable, but how do you know which show is right for you? I mean, I was doing, this is a few years ago, doing Bobby Tracy, and it did really well for me, and I was quite happy. And I mentioned this to two other friends who are makers and said, you should think about doing this show. It's a really good one. So on my recommendation, they both did that show. And one person did exceptionally well and immediately wanted to book up for next year. My other friend completely bombed and didn't really do anything at all. Now, that's got nothing to do with the work. It's got to do with where the work is, and is the audience there for that work. Now, they both did another show in a different part of the country about 6 months later, and had exactly the reverse effect. She did extremely well and he bombed. And this is what we find. You can have a really good product, but just because it doesn't sell at that show doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that item. It means that maybe that show's not right for you. When we were doing the gardenware, for instance, we decided to do some homes and gardens exhibitions. And the first one was at Tatton Park. And we sold everything. We in fact had to send back to the workshop and bring more stuff. It was selling so quickly, and we'd never known anything like it. It was so busy. We had a part-time secretary who did the sort of book and paperwork, and we asked Linda to come over to help because it was so busy on the stand, and she brought more stock with her. And we were then looking forward to a further 5 of these shows to be equally as busy. The other 5 were extremely disappointing. And it just goes to prove that what you have to do is find where your product or your item or your work sells, and then find out also where it doesn't sell, and then make an appropriate judgment as to what. So unfortunately, sometimes you have to speculate to accumulate, because there's no way of really telling which show is right for you. But over the last few years, Instagram has come into play, and probably any of you potters might know a friend of mine, Florian Gadsby, and who has been absolutely incredibly successful with sales on and through Instagram. And of course, it's a platform where you can very, very quickly put your work in front of a lot of people. Whereas in the old days, you would have to sort of trudge around the craft shops and the galleries and show your work. Now you can very quickly present your work to a massive audience. But again, this can be double-edged sword. You could actually be inundated with a level of work that you can't cope with. So sometimes it pays to be honest. And if the workload is too much and the interest is too great, people can be very understanding and say, you could say, look, I'm extremely busy at the moment. I can't, fulfill your order. Would you be willing to wait? And what I found over the years is when something's difficult to get hold of, they want it more and more. Whereas when it's easy to get hold of, the sort of desire for that item sort of wanes a little bit. And if your product is right, if your product is good, it will self-perpetuate. But you have to keep on top of that, making sure that what you were producing is of a good quality, that you can produce it successfully. One of the difficult areas that people get into is when your product or your item is selling successfully, and then you think of employment, and that is a really, really tricky one, because very often what we produce is so very personal to the individual that it's extremely difficult to pass that on to somebody else. Sometimes it means that you might take somebody on to help with sort of packing or something like that, or more sort of, don't want to use it, but sort of like the sort of more practical side of running the workshop or something like that. Whereas when you try to get into getting somebody to produce your work for them, that's a lot more sort of problematic. It gets quite difficult, because then you lose control of the item. And then very often what we do is extremely personal. I know that I couldn't ask somebody else to make my pots for me, but I know many people who do. And a friend of mine who is only not been put in a vast amount of time, has been extremely successful with her work. And she came to see me and said, I just cannot cope with the level of demand for my work. And what she decided to do was to create a commercial version of her individual work. So she could concentrate on her more gallery-based and individual work, but she decided to take inspiration from her work and produce a range of work that, instead of being hand decorated, had transfer prints on it, and farmed out the production of that to a small company, and they produced that for her. So she could produce that, sell that, and that satisfied a particular section of the market, but then that released her to concentrate on her more sort of individual work. Now, that's not going to suit everybody, but I would say at least once a month, somebody, an individual maker, studio potter, comes, either phones me or emails me or contacts me and will say, do you know anybody who can make this for me? Now, that's an enviable position to be in, obviously, that your work is in such demand that you can't make enough of it. But again, you have to be very, very careful, because putting out a sort of cheap and cheerful version of what you do can harm your individual work. So it's a fine balance on how you do that. Occasionally, and again, this has happened to friends of mine, where a large company has come to them and said, we absolutely love your work. Can we buy the idea off you? And that's a really tricky one, because obviously if a larger company buys your concept and mass produces it, that completely finishes your ability to make your work and sell it as an individual item. So I would normally say to people, if you're going to do that, be prepared to sell that and walk away from it, and then commence a completely new sort of product range, a new item. Maybe that's an opportunity to walk away from something that you may be getting tired of making, and an opportunity to come up with something new. But you know, that doesn't always happen, but it does happen occasionally. And of course, these companies then will buy that concept from you and then take it to, you know, third world, and you know, it will end up being sold very cheaply in supermarkets and things like that. And you've probably seen in supermarkets sort of things that have their origins in handmade pots, but are actually produced commercially. On the other hand, sometimes you're approached by companies who like what you do and will then ask you to design or develop a range of commercial ware for them. Now, obviously, you would have to go into that fairly cautiously, and there will be sort of different sort of offers as to the way that you would be paid for that. But that's up to you. And then fairly tight contracts as to what you can and can't do with that concept or idea afterwards. You know, I've designed and developed a number of commercial ranges for some of the large manufacturers, and very often written into that contract, the main sort of design feature of that item, you sign away the right to that. So they'll say, you know, whatever that item is, they'll say, you cannot use this portion of the idea for anybody else, you know. And once I developed a range of tableware for one manufacturer, another manufacturer had seen this, really liked it, and then invited me to come along and design a range for them. And it was obviously that they wanted me to do something very similar to what I'd done for the other company. And I said, I'm really, really sorry, but they would sue me for every cent I was worth if I did that. I can do something for you, but it has to be completely different to that I'd done for the other company. So yeah.
It's just hit 7 o'clock and we've got a question in the chat. And I actually have a few questions myself. So we have a question from Elizabeth Murphy. She said, in considering developing a business plan, would you recommend it is better to maintain stock of your products or to make products to order?
It really depends on the item and the item that you're producing. Now, I have actually physical knowledge of this situation. And the weird thing is, if you make for stock, the stock item you make won't sell. And they always want the thing that you haven't got. It's really weird. So you'd put something into stock, but they'd always ask for something that you hadn't got in stock. So many of the manufacturers now only carry like a buffer stock. They almost make to order, you know, because you can end up with a lot of stock that you can't shift because it's not what they want. You know, it's the old adage, you make 50 blue mugs and then an order comes in for 50 green ones. And I'm not quite sure how anybody ever squares the circle on that one. But if you're a small maker and you've got a limited product range, then it probably is feasible. And I remember a guy I used to work with, he'd worked in industry, and he said a lot of people, what they do is when it's quiet, they stop making. And that's a big mistake. So if you've got a little bit of a quiet period, sometimes you think, right, this is a good opportunity to make, you know, 100 of those mugs that sell really well or whatever. So it's a tricky one, but I think it's really down to the item and how many ranges that you do or how many colours you offer. Funny, I mean, I don't know if anybody, a friend of mine called Mark Daly, who makes these fabulous mugs that are slip trailed, and they're only black and white, and he puts an accent of either gold or platinum on them. And he decided to put a bit of he got a quiet spot, and he decided to put a little bit of a stock in of his most popular mug. And he said, every order that's come in isn't for that one that I've put in stock. And he's trying to persuade them to take that. Well, I've got this one, but it was really strange. It was a sort of object lesson in you make something and then they always want the other, you know. I like that vase, but can I have it in blue?
It's typical, isn't it, Kevin? Kevin, thank you so much. And also the question that I had was the maker you were talking about who was a potter and decided to have a commercial line of work produced. Was that Helen Beard?
Yeah.
Aha. She is coming up in our series of talks. She's week 4. So if anybody's curious to hear what it's like for a potter or a maker deciding to work with manufacture, hang in tight. Week 4, October 14th. Helen will be joining us. Yeah,
I mean, she's not the only one. Many people that I've sort of worked with and helped to facilitate sort of connections with sort of industry have had that dilemma. I'll give you another perfect example. You might want to look them up, and she's very, very successful potter. It's a little company, and they're based down in Brighton, called Brickit Davda. You see a lot of their work on trendy cookery programs and adverts. Now, she grew and grew and grew, and wanted to expand. And she went out to, I think it was Portugal, and approached a company out there to produce, and they were more than happy to do that. But they ended up sort of ripping her off. What they basically did is copied her product and sort of cut her out of the loop. But fortunately, they didn't really do justice to the work, so it never really worked. And she then decided to basically increase her ability to produce bigger workshops. She employed a couple of people, rationalised the making techniques and processes, and has never looked back.
Oh, Kevin, thank you so much. You have so many more stories to share. I absolutely know it. But thank you so much for sharing what you have done today. Again, if anybody has any further questions, please feel free to share them in the chat. We can also circle back on them during the Q&A at the very end. Kevin, thank you.
Thank you.
So it is, I will remove the spotlight from you. And it is my pleasure now to introduce you to Nancy Fuller. Nancy is an incredibly talented and modest wood-firing potter based in Aberdeenshire. Her studio is in Aberdeenshire. She's based in Perthshire. She has a glorious sensibility with the ceramic material and wood-firing process. I'm sure for those who are familiar with her work will agree that her forms and surfaces are absolutely sublime. Nancy was born in a rural village in Taiwan and raised in the countryside in Scotland. Her wood-firing pottery seeks to address how she has experienced this unique journey through both her creative processes and fired results. She's travelled and learned from experts and master craftspeople worldwide, having studied in the Nakazato Studio Shigaraki in Japan, Wenshan Ceramics Studio in Taiwan, the oh my days, my pronunciation, I may need help.
You're doing well.
Thank you. The Snake Kiln in Taiwan. And here in the UK and Scotland, she's undertaken residencies also in the US, Australia, Denmark, and Japan, only to name a few. Nancy's joining us today to talk about her experience, our journey through the development of practice, an open and honest account. Please feel free to share any questions in the chat through Nancy's talk. We'll hope to pick them up through conversation. For those that we don't get a chance to discuss as part of her presentation, we can pick them up in the Q&A. Nancy, it is an absolute joy to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's my delight to hand over to you. So I'm going to share my screen. I have Nancy's presentation here. So hopefully this will work well. Bear with me. Okay. Play from start. Can you all see that okay? I can't see any of you. Oh no, I can do. I'll just... Oh, I had that. Thank you, Helen. I've got a thumbs up. I'll put myself on mute. Nancy, over to you. Take it away.
Thank you. So sorry, I'm going to read from my notes from this. I wanted to do this presentation because I've gained so much from the ceramics community and felt that I should give back, especially to makers starting out on their journey. I get really nervous to be visible and to speak in public, and I thought that I would share that with you so that you can know that it's hard even for those of us with more experience. It's challenging for me to be visible because I grew up as the only ethnic minority in my area and hate to stand out. I recently came across a great quote by photographer and writer Nadia Melli, who says, "You do it afraid. The opposite of fear is not courage, it's action. Get rid of the false narrative that fear is something to get rid of. In other words, confidence comes through doing and not waiting for the right moment to come." I began working with ceramics in my final year at Duncan of Johnstone College of Art in Dundee, where I studied fine art printmaking. At that time, nobody at college was printing onto ceramics, so these were an experiment to transfer images and documents onto hand-stretched porcelain slabs by screen printing directly onto the clay. After graduating, my wish to combine art with Chinese language led me to do a master's in the history of art and archaeology of Asia at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. A language scholarship attained during my master's took me to Taiwan in search of my roots. Here I discovered the aesthetic pleasure of using handmade pottery in the tea ceremony. It's the taking part and using the pottery that gives it meaning. This was in sharp contrast to the conceptual art education I had received at art school. The ceremony creates its own space and time. It took as long as it needed to and created a sensory environment to slow down and pay attention to the details. I was later to discover similarities in wood firing. Inspired by this experience, I enrolled in a pottery night class in Taipei with Xu Zhaoping. I was invited to see his unloading of the nearby Inga Ceramics Museum, Anagama. I have to say it really was love at first sight. I didn't even know what I was looking at, but I could sense that Anagama firing was something I definitely wanted to pursue. It was like the missing jigsaw piece for me. It embraced language, culture, tradition, creativity, and the natural environment, and in essence revealed the Taiwan I was looking for through the medium of wood firing. This discovery situated me within my culture and gave me a sense of connection by placing me in the clay community. At the same time, it provided me with an authentic experience to build on. In my quest to learn more, I visited the Junan snake kiln in central Taiwan to study traditional techniques and wood firing with Lin Rei Hua. But I soon realized that I needed a more concentrated training if I was to build my own kiln back in Scotland. A Craft Potters Association grant gave me the opportunity to do a month-long residency at the Shigaraki Ceramic Cultural Park in Japan. However, it became apparent that I needed to spend more than a month to study there, and so I sought an Anagama master to study under. At first, this seemed like an impossible task because I was female, didn't speak Japanese, and there was a recession. But after repeatedly asking, I was finally introduced to Suzuki Shigeji, who accepted me for a year-long training.
When we, Helen, or Nancy, when you and I spoke earlier,
Yeah.
We chatted about how difficult that must have been, and if you could give advice to anybody who is really so passionate about making a connection or learning something, how you would recommend them going about it.
I think, yeah, we talked about that. And I think I said that I think you should definitely always try to reach out because you'll never know if you'd never ask, kind of thing. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You also give some really interesting advice because you were saying that you often get inquiries and you're often not able to help. You're not in a position to be able to help just now. But you talked about like the framing of how somebody might be able to reach out and keeping it kind of short and sweet And for people to share an email introducing themselves. You might be able to describe it better than me, Nancy.
Well, yeah, I do get a lot of inquiries, and you know, if I'm particularly, well, even when I'm not busy, it can be quite overwhelming how, you know, having to respond to each one individually. And some people want to share links to their work or photograph albums. And I was just saying that for me, it has to be really concise so I can get very sort of a grasp really quickly of what you're about and why you want to study with me. Because if it's too long, I just don't get to the end of it, or I don't get the chance to see everything you want to try and communicate to me. So.
Absolutely. And also you had mentioned something really interesting about trying to make like a meaningful and perhaps authentic connection with somebody. It's not just your qualifications and your experience, that because you're asking to work alongside somebody, that connection that you might have with them is going to be really important.
Yes, I think so. So I think it's really important to communicate how you are as a person and just write from your heart why it is you want to work with me. I mean, it sounds really simple. I know it's really difficult, but that's what's going to make you stand out, you know, from other people who are writing as well. And that's what speaks to me most of all, but it might not be for everybody. So
I think it's just really good advice and good things to bear in mind if we're ever reaching out to anybody in particular, just to know that, yeah, there are other ways of doing it and to perhaps keep it in mind. Oh, thank you, Nancy. I'll move on to the next slide.
So just going back to that, I think it also really reveals your motivation, what your motivations are for wanting to study with me. So, in Japan, connections are very important. And this connection opened the door to the local older generation potters. I spent the year cycling around, visiting different potters and watching them making, firing and unloading their kilns. This embodied learning had a profound effect on me and again situated me within the pottery community. At the end of my year-long training, the pots that I kept coming back to were the quieter ones, the ones with less ash effects and that revealed more of the clay's flavour. Much as I loved the shigaraki feldspar-rich clay, I had the feeling that everything I had learned, I didn't want to recreate this clay on my return to the UK. It just so happened that Karatsu master Nakazato Takashi was a guest artist at the Shigaraki Ceramic Cultural Park. I was intrigued by his Namban firing style, which employs reduction cooling. I thought that I might obtain the results I was looking for from the UK raw clays through this new way of firing, and I was invited by him to study reduction cooling at the Anderson Ranch Art Centre in Aspen. What emerged from this was a firing aesthetic that to me embodies my own character and background. Building my own kiln took me back to my family home in rural Aberdeenshire. I did this with the support of the then Scottish Arts Council startup grant, together with Tora Hobbit, a Norwegian potter who I met during a Nakazato Takashi workshop at Gulegå, the International Ceramic Research Centre in Denmark. Yeah, I pronounced that right. She said she would come and help me so that she could learn from my mistakes and build a better one. My first exhibition in the UK was in 2008, together with Peter Swanson at the Harlequin Gallery, London, showing the pots I had made during my year in Shigaraki. After that, I had difficulty finding galleries to show my work. It was like they didn't quite know how to place it. At that time, nobody in the UK was really doing this dry, matte wood-fired aesthetic, and it was as though my work was too much in the Japanese tradition. Galleries wondered whether to place the large jars in gardens. And to get the prizes I needed, I tried showing with fine art galleries, but found that the pottery was weighted in second place to paintings or put where maybe an umbrella stand might be. So out of frustration, I decided to represent myself and to slowly educate people about what I was trying to capture. This gave me control of the marketing and sales side of the business. Finally, in 2013, I was offered a solo exhibition at the Aberfeldy Watermill, and work that hadn't sold in London, Glasgow and Edinburgh sold on the open day. Sorry, the Aberfeldy Watermill is in Perthshire, in rural Perthshire. So it's important to have the patience and to find the right location. If your market niche is small, you need as wide an audience as possible to see it. And so in 2015, I set up my first online shop inspired by the way I saw other craftspeople creating a market through promoting and selling their work. Don't necessarily take it personally if work doesn't sell. Sometimes I lose confidence and I'm about to take a piece off my online shop when suddenly it goes. You have to remember handmade work is not for everyone, and it's really a matter of waiting until the right buyer comes along. Through imagery and text, I try to show my audience the ideas behind my work. This is where being on social media comes into its own, because this becomes more polished over time. It helps you to find a voice through content. The closer the work is to yourself, the stronger it is. I would like to stress the importance of paying care and attention to what you do as a way of investing in your practice. I like to do my own photography because I know exactly what I'm looking for, and for me, it translates all the way through from the work. I found it important to also try to capture what you want your buyers to feel through your work. An online presence has landed me offers to exhibit at galleries like Make House and Worth, Somerset, and opportunities like this has helped me to take my work to a new level. Increased visibility has also led to me being invited to present at events like Cultural Confluence, Wood Firing Symposium in Montana, and Fire on the Ridge in Tasmania at Ben Richardson's studio in preparation for the Australian Ceramics Triennale. They're represented in a panel discussion and exhibited my work together with Ben, Catherine White from the US, and Anna-Mette Hjortsøy from Denmark, and Elisa Helen Hansen from Norway. That opportunity took me to Bornholm the following year to fire Anna-Mette's clay kiln together with Iwami Shinsuke. They're working on a wild clay project, and that's still ongoing. In fact, in the last 3 years, this nomadic way of firing has been a source of income, as well as hugely beneficial for my professional development. Residencies, workshops, and events have all played an important part in meeting like-minded people who've become friends for life. So when I look back in the rearview mirror, I'd like to just share a few things to help you to not get stuck in a hole. So this is just in the clay kiln I showed you earlier. Life happens and there may well be gaps in your practice. Don't feel bad about time you've taken out, because your work is about everything you are and have been through. And we're just saying that you can use this, see this as an advantage rather than a disadvantage. It takes time to hone craft skills and to find your voice. There's no shortcut to this. Don't necessarily follow conventions if they don't serve you. Be curious, and if you don't seem to fit a market, create your own. But this has to be done through educating your audience. It doesn't magically happen by itself. Make sure your prices cover your costs. By doing so, you help to raise the value of all that we do. Don't devalue yourself by cutting corners, and make sure you're doing things that bring you joy, because that's where the energy comes. And finally, I would just like to share that I'm taking part in the exhibition Kogarashi, the first cold wind at Modern Mabel in London this October. It's taken 10 years, but now a gallery is finally willing to show a cracked piece of work. At first, I thought this pot was a failure, but then I realized it had something that might speak to people during these fractured times. So just to come full circle, as I said at the start, don't wait for the right time, because there will always be hurdles to overcome. They just change as your practice changes. So that's it.
Wow. My days, Nancy. Thank you so much for letting me escape that. Oh my days. That was so inspirational. It's so interesting to see how one opportunity, how your connection with one person led to another, from the time where you were searching for somebody to work with in Japan to teach you kiln making techniques, and how that carried along in the journey and you moved on to the next. How For you, how important have people been in your practice?
Oh, incredibly important. And I'm really, truly thankful for the people who've helped me along the way. And I definitely wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for all the help that I've received from colleagues. So
And I guess it just takes being yourself. As scary and frightening as networking seems, it's a bit businessy, isn't it? It's just kind of making friends out there with other makers, and where an opportunity to work together might not happen straight away. You just don't know what could happen down the line. I'm sure many of your relationships have come to fruition, or something has happened many years down the line.
Yeah, that's right. And I would also say that the networking side is actually probably the most enjoyable side of doing these workshops and conferences. And a lot of other people say the same as well. Not many people really like presenting. So, and then you just never know what will come of these relationships that you make. So that's why I say try to overcome your fear and not get stuck, because one thing will always lead to another thing. And you just never know where it's going to take you. So just to try and keep that flow going somehow, and things will always come.
Oh, Nancy, that is so wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm getting lovely messages from everybody saying how amazing, interesting and inspirational that was. Nancy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
There we go. And so it is at this point, I'm pleased now to introduce you to our next speaker, Harriet Coles. But bear with me. Bear with me one moment. I'll just put her on spotlight. Where are you? There you are, Harriet. I see you. Spotlight for everybody. Harriet, hello. Welcome. So just to introduce Harriet, Harriet Coles has come to Clay and her career in a fascinating journey working at the intersection between art and science as a journalist, scientist, curator and artist. It's pretty incredible how all of that weaves together so amazingly. I really love it. She draws on the 17th and 18th century British tradition of political pottery. She makes ceramics that take contemporary issues into domestic settings. This has formed the foundations for the Brexitware project, which she initiated after the referendum in June 2016. She's worked closely with generous and knowledgeable people here in the city of Stoke-on-Trent, Kath and Paul Holloway, who were introduced to her through topographies of the obsolete conference and a paper delivered by Professor for Ceramics for Staffordshire University, Neil Brownsword. She continues to work with people and industry here in Stoke, now working with Edwards and Lockett, a small family-run business in Longton, Stoke-on-Trent, for the production of Brexitware. What started as a passion project has taken off in incredible ways. She describes how it quickly took a life of its own. This evening, Harriet will share with us her experiences and insights from this work, and looks at how she started an accidental business. Harriet, thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing more with us about your project and about your creative career. It is my pleasure to hand over to you.
Thank you, and thank you also for asking me to come and talk with you about the Brexitware years. It's been an extraordinary experience. So I hope to give you a sense of how the whole thing began, where it took off and how I coped with that, and also sort of where I hope to go from now. Okay, so Brexitware, as you said, was a record of our collective experiences of Brexit. Some of them, just some of them. It was, it's very selective. And I started originally doing hand building. So I was hand building these rather rickety plates and decorating them with my own painting. And after that extraordinary event, which, thank you, you knew what it was called. I had no idea. I went along to my local museum and there was Neil Brownsword talking, found it very interesting. And there was this demonstration by the Paul Holdway, which again was really magnetic. We started chatting and boom, so that was it. He introduced me to a whole world of ceramics producers and enablers, facilitators. It was an extraordinary experience, really, of just having every question that came up into my head, there was an answer, or there was the right person to answer it. So, I mean, Paul has been essentially, to me, a real mentor throughout all of this. He's not the only person. There have been some other great people along the way, but you know, he taught me, and I'm very, very, very grateful about that. But anyway, so I wanted to show you, if you haven't seen it already, the Brexit Wear collection. So I shall, excuse me for a second, share my screen. Here we go. And just expand it for you and start at the beginning. Okay, so this was the first piece, very much in the tradition of 18th century spode wear, and which at its time was very, very popular. And I used the willow pattern landscape to inhabit as a place where I could put a record of, in this case, this plate, the Weeping Willow plate, the period just straight after the referendum. So the referendum and then its aftermath. There's a lot of symbolism that I painted in here. It was all painted, well, as I said, I originally produced my hand-built plates, but these pieces were originally painted on paper and then made into decals with screen printing through Graham Lockett at Edwards Lockett. I don't know if you want to know anything about the symbolism I've used, but there's Sangat at the bottom of Calais. Calais is about here. There's a broken down bridge. The original bridge obviously wasn't smashed up. These are some Britons here with a wrecking bar and a sledgehammer. There's the Victoria Tower housing Big Ben, which had taken a real knock at the time of the referendum, storm clouds brewing, etc. So I had great fun. I really packed in the symbolism. The second piece was the egg cups, and they've been a very big seller. The egg cups, I sort of used the decorative motifs of the willow pattern and adapted them to sort of say what I wanted to say. This was the third piece. This is based on a J&G Meakin teacup, which was produced in around sort of early 1900s. There was this big fad for reading tea leaves, and this was based on one I saw in a British Museum exhibition, and it was called Gypsy Teresa's Fortune Telling Cup. And I almost fell over. I mean, at that moment, I looked and I thought, oh, I've got to make one for Theresa May. You know, this is my opportunity to sort of really get in there with the politics. So the graphics were actually done by Rebecca Davis, a great Stoke artist of the Portland Inn Project, I'm sure you'll all know. And she very sweetly took over the graphics. I was sort of falling over myself. I'm not an experienced artist. I was falling over myself and I wanted to get this made, and she stepped in and helped me with the graphics. Interestingly, I offered her, she could either take an hourly rate for her efforts, or she could take a share in the sales, and she chose the wrong one, as it happens, but you know, it would have been a gamble to take a share in the sales. So yeah, in my cup, there's all these sort of outcomes of what can happen in socially and politically after Brexit. So, and I tried really hard to make it as non-partisan as possible. So I split up the elements of design, and I've got, whilst I've also here got Great somewhere, can't find it, but there's Great and Britain, but I've split them up because then Great could go with No Deal, or it could go with NHS, or maybe Collapse would go with Britain, or with NHS, or with house prices. You know, I sort of played around with it to let people read into it whatever they wanted to. The fourth piece, and these were all produced at a rate of one a year. The fourth piece here is the Union plate. I think probably most of my sort of heart poured into this one. It was based on the pieces in the Blue Room. I just love the Spode display up there in the Blue Room. which Paul pointed me in the direction of, and Mick Escombe has really helped me access and taught me a lot about it. Anyway, this was a piece based on the Indian Sporting series from Spode, and yeah, it took on a life of its own there. I love learning about the technical aspects of production, and so I did sort of adapt things. For example, in Spodeware, you get the rim is made by basically just doubling half of it and then putting the pattern on the other side. So rather than actually do that, I mirrored but also altered. So there was the People's March for the vote. People's Vote March after the referendum, and it was mirroring. Do you remember that Breaking Point poster at the time of the lobbying for, you know, the beginning of the Brexit campaign? Well, this was sort of the group of people they had on it. So I sort of tried to mirror. Here we have the unicorn of Scotland holding the European Union Act, which took us into the European Union, and here's the Lion of England holding the Lisbon Treaty. So they mirror each other, etc. Anyway, it was quite a complex set of symbolism, which I hugely enjoyed. And then finally, I've also played around with it. So this is something I've done in lockdown, where I've just been overfiring the egg cups to see sort of, I call it meltdown, just because I'm beginning to wonder what's going on. But anyway, I don't want to talk about my politics there, so I'll put that away. Okay, so I produced each of these pieces. They were all on bone china, and they were, as I said, this record. But I hoped, the aim of the project originally was to get to try to ensure that there would be some Brexit ware in 300 years' time in a museum somewhere that would record the fact that Britain had gone through this repeated series of questionings about its relationship to Europe. And I think probably for me, the biggest achievement of this project, and my proudest part of it, is that it's already in 10 collections around the world, 10 public collections around the world. And I feel like I'm on the first step to making sure that in 300 years' time, there will be a piece of Brexit ware with a little note next to it saying, you know, Brexit was a time in British history when. So yeah, that's been really very exciting. The mass production, I needed to mass produce Brexit ware, firstly in order, because it's made out of ceramics, I needed to mass produce it to get enough pieces out there to know that one might endure for that 300-year target. So that was my first motivation, if you like, behind the mass production. And Graham in Edwards and Lockett has been incredibly patient with me, because I've had very exacting demands on him. I've wanted to fire at a temperature they don't normally fire at. I wanted it to be in glaze rather than on glaze. So we had to go to cobalt carbonate. We've generated a rather large number of seconds and disasters through that. I had to have 2 screens. So in order to get the tonal range for the plates, I had to go for 2 screens rather than a single one in the making of the decals. So Graham's been incredibly patient, and actually hats off to him. He's sort of enjoyed it, I think, slightly, maybe most of the time. But there was a sort of other reason why I wanted to mass produce. As the project went on, there was this whole period in British politics where people were claiming the referendum outcome as theirs. So you had obviously the MPs who'd lobbied for us to leave the European Union. They were saying, well, here, the people have spoken, you know, this is it, it's happened. But on the other hand, there was also, as I said, that People's Vote movement right after the referendum. I don't know if you recall the marches by people who voted to remain, flooding the streets and claiming that they wanted to have a second referendum. So I found that really odd tussle, struggle really, for ownership of Brexit. and wanted somehow to represent that in it. So again, the mass production was about selling Brexit, I suppose, Brexit wear, Brexit. In my mind, it was synonymous. No, not really, but I had to get this ownership. And to do this, obviously, I had to make a lot of it. And I had to, my feeling was, if people wanted to own Brexit, then they actually had to just sort of, I would sell it to them, you know, there was the ownership. It's sort of a bit of a skewy one. That has been an interesting concept to play with. I think it's interesting because it wasn't the original motivation behind the project. And I think it was probably the sort of most fundamentally flawed part of the project, because what happened in the end was, as I was thinking, I was with great irony playing at selling the people Brexit and allowing them to own it. You know, I was playing at having a business, but in fact, consumerism and consumer forces sort of turned around and hit me and said, okay, if you're going to play at selling, well, we're going to make you sell. And it sort of snowballed, I suppose, for me. It's quite a powerful experience. I think that, I mean, there is that one project in Walthamstow that was absolutely brilliantly harnessed. It did harness capitalism when it printed the banknotes and sold them. They were designed by artists, featuring local dignitaries, or no, not dignitaries, people who done really important work for the community. And they were sold at face value to people. The money that was taken was then used to buy off the bad debt from community projects so that people would be able to carry on contributing to the community without any sense of having, you know, the burden of debt. Oh, that was brilliant. So you can do it, but I really failed on that score. But in the meantime, the business side snuck up on me, and I found pretty quickly that I was handling sort of thousands of pounds worth of sales coming in at me. And at many times, I think I felt slightly overwhelmed by it. I think both the speakers have talked about managing that aspect of sales, not wanting to overstep yourself. Whereas I was sort of tumbling along the whole time, just trying to take control of it, trying to cope with what was going to be dealt back to me. I often ask why it was so financially viable. And obviously there's the issue of everyone wanting to sort of have their tourist piece for Brexit. You know, you want your souvenir of what's been happening. But I think probably I tapped into several very viable markets without realizing it. The blue and white transferware that I used in 3 of the pieces was, for me, symbolized that sort of nostalgic nationalism that was inspired by the Vote Leave campaign, by harking back to the time when Stoke was, you know, really buzzing with its industrial revolution, and a time when Britain was a ruler of a large empire. So that was my symbolism, but actually it turns out that there was a whole load of people who just really loved blue and white transfer around the world, and that they were willing to buy it. And that was yeah. So that was one source of people I could depend on to buy. I'd always wanted to look at the collective experiences of Brexit, and I think by being non-partisan, I ended up with a project that people on both sides of the political debate were saying, were owning the project as theirs. So I quite often got comments from people saying, you know, have you made anything for the Remainers, or vice versa? And so the non-partisan aspect of it actually unintentionally doubled my customer base simply by, you know, appealing to everybody. And the other market, which I think is more obscure, but oddly enough, I think has had the biggest impact, is the one of political pottery, particularly harking back to the 18th and 19th century political pottery tradition. There was this wonderful curator at the Walker Gallery who recognised that aspect of my work early on, Nicola Scott. And Nicola set up an exhibition case in the Walker Gallery where she basically juxtaposed Brexit ware and 18th century enamelled creamware with all these wonderful, I don't know if you know this stuff, but like Napoleon, you know, they little speech bubbles coming out of people's mouths saying, oh, Master Boney, you know, take that and things, or John Bull attacking him and winning the day. But the point being that historically there's been this conflict in our relationship with Europe, with France, since the times of Napoleon. So Nicola did this really lovely exhibition, and it was really gratifying to see a curator just really getting the project and being able to place it out there for people. That was fantastic. And both speakers so far have talked about the idea that every piece has its audience. And Nancy and Kevin have both, sorry if I'm paraphrasing you wrong, but basically, you know, you're human, you make something, there will be other humans who respond to that. And I think one of the issues for makers is the challenge of how you get your audience to meet your work. Kevin went through some of the processes that you can go through. I did try briefly to do this, I suppose, to take on a marketing role, and I turned to advertising because I'd worked in journalism. I'd always been aware of advertisers in a publication. I turned to paper advertising, the Big Issue and Private Eye, and it was a complete waste of money. I just, you know, it was fine. It was a good experience. I didn't spend much, and yeah, I don't think I lost anything, but I certainly didn't make anything. I also boosted a few posts on Instagram and Facebook, and I am no Florian Gadsby. That didn't happen either. So I think it sort of happened without me trying. I think the biggest driver for Brexit wear sales has been the media. So it's been the news outlets, and that they have picked up on that as a consequence of the political pottery aspect of it. So very early on, I heard of an exhibition that Ian Hislop was going to be doing at the British Museum, and I contacted the buyer at the shop. You know, this is me, Nancy, really sticking my neck out and trying to make connections with people that, you know, didn't know how to do it, but I tried, and it paid off. Yeah, I contacted the buyer and said, here you've got this exhibition, I object, by Ian Hislop, I've got this product that I think might be of interest, and they took it, and that was great. So it sold in that exhibition shop at the British Museum, and then they carried that on because the sales had been popular enough. They took it into their Grenville Room shop and sold it there as well, right up until 2020. So it really had a long run there. I also, Brexit Wear was in an exhibition in the V&A, and again, the exhibition took it and they sold it, and then the, I don't know how my time's going, I'm okay. And then yeah, they carried on as well. What I will say is, if you're going to sell through these large outlets, and I don't think you mentioned this, Kevin, but I think it's sort of certainly true, that the buyers drive a really hard bargain. So for me, I was down to making almost less than £1 per item per sale. You know, once I'd covered the costs of the Edwards and Lockett and their profit, and I'd the V&A or the British Museum, you know, they whacked a great big price on my product, but I myself was making very, very little. You factor in economy of scale, so I was selling hundreds of pieces to them, so I was getting hundreds of pounds back again, but it wasn't as much as I could have made, and even if I doubled that, that would have been great. So I would say to people, if you are going to go to these big people, these big shops, then keep steady and don't give up, you know, just don't fix your sum and don't compromise, because I certainly gave in quite a few times. Anyway, the biggest point about selling through these exhibitions and these big museums is exposure. I really cannot value for you, I can't quantify how much that exposure meant to the project, but I suspect it was immense. I had editors from news outlets contacting me and saying, oh, I saw your stuff in the V&A shop, or, you know, this or that. So there was this snowball effect that even if you're not making a huge amount of money, you're buying the exposure through not taking large profit. At the time when I started these museum shops, and I should add the Spode Heritage Centre shop as well, Mick Escomb's shop there, which is great and gathers a lot of experts and people, you know, people with a really lively interest in this stuff come to his shop. Those three outlets actually, I think between them sort of kept the whole project going right up to today, because you can time the time when the news editors and all the features started rolling in and the requests from the time when I was in those shops. So yeah, the media. I always say, everyone says to me, oh gosh, you know, I'm going to do this interview, what should I do, what should I do? For God's sake, get out your point, the one you want to first. You see MPs doing it the whole time. They don't answer the question, they say what they want to. So just make sure you get that point that you want to say out first, whatever it is, get it out there. The unpredictability of the sales really struck a chord with what Kevin was saying about how on earth you stock and what you stock. The only principle I went by, and maybe a lot of people can't follow that, was don't go into debt. So I never bought more stock than I was able to pay for. So a lot of the profit of Brexitware just went on to continuing the Brexitware habit, really, and the Brexitware lifestyle. I was able to come up to the BCB a lot and, you know, visit Stoke and get to know all the museums. So it has allowed a lot of sort of fertile movement in my mind. But yeah, it was just don't get into debt was the one thing that I really avoided.
We have a question that's come in from
Yes.
Sadia Kanum. Apologies, Sadia, if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. She has asked, or apologies, they have asked, how does Harriet feel about remaining impartial in designing Brexitware and the resulting success, and how each side claims it as their own?
Yeah. I think probably for me, it's really difficult because I obviously have my own political position, and I think this project was largely one of therapeutic value for me, to try and make sense of what I saw as being a political landscape that I'd understood for years, being suddenly revolutionized and shaken up. So I think it was important to me to do this for therapy. I think that through the project, having met people from both camps and both persuasions and had the opportunity to hear the reasons for how they voted, it's actually sort of, I don't know, I've come to respect both sides of the argument, not for everyone, and probably if I spoke to me, not for me. I was very passionate in what I believed in for the vote. So yeah, I think it's probably made me understand that the situation is much more complex than I had seen in the beginning, and that it's important to respect how people are. I met a lovely little chap outside Parliament who is from Stoke, actually, and he told me he'd followed his family and voted as his elders had voted to leave, and that now that time had passed and he'd seen the impact, he would have voted Remain. And I really value that, his honesty there. You know, you talk to people through the project, because I'm not campaigning or lobbying to change people's minds, because I'm recording for all of us. I think it has felt sort of good, I'm sorry to say. I mean, yeah, that's my answer. Yeah, there's one other anecdote I wanted to tell based on Kevin's point about social media, which is that I had this extraordinary experience right early on where a woman bought some Brexit wear, and it turned out that she was married to the physicist, whatever he's called. What's he called? Brian Cox, that's right. Yeah, Brian Cox's wife. And she gave it to him for his birthday. And on the morning of his birthday, he thought it'd be a really good idea. He obviously quite pleased with his present, and he put his breakfast on it and tweeted it. And within 1 minute of that post going out, my phone, I'd never seen this before, it actually turned into a sort of continuous tone of notification. I had to switch it off because it was like this paroxysm of notifications. And it took me, interestingly, for social media, the interest lasts very briefly. So it's like, 48 hours and it's gone. But those 48 hours of orders took me a good month to clear in terms of packing. And I've done it all myself, packing and sending off, etc. So yeah, it can be quite extraordinary. Sorry, another anecdote. Do I have time? The BBC. 6 o'clock news. I did an interview for the BBC for the 6 o'clock news, and it was pre-recorded interview. The next night they aired it on TV, and I got, a nice activity on the website, and people were buying Brexit wear, and that was all well and good. The next day they put it up on their news website, and it was unbelievable, the impact. I mean, to me, as someone who has been pre-social media, to see the impact of something being posted on a website and what happens then to sales was quite extraordinary, really. That was well over a month's worth of work to try and clear that out. Yeah. But going back to the question, I don't know whether they were also interested in the profit, because I think what I have been able to do is plough the profit back into projects that I believe in. So the Portland Inn project's been fantastic, being able to give to them, other creative projects. It's been really nice being able to, I've sort of not taken the money so much as sort of let it just wash through me and past me. And that has sort of, because I wasn't expecting a profit in the first place, the idea of maximizing profit or, any of that didn't make any sense. It's been nice to actually just sort of let it sort of flow past me. But yeah, there would be plenty of things I would do if I wanted to maximize profit. And as Kevin was talking about, the idea of rationalizing process and trying to, make things flow easily in production. I could have not wanted to do in-glaze firings. I could have done on-glaze. It would have been a much cheaper project. It wouldn't have had the look of the 18th century ceramics, but I would have been able to churn out enough hard and soft Brexit egg cups to satisfy everyone in the country. I didn't think anyone used egg cups when I produced them, so it's been quite a shock to me that people do actually put eggs in.
You're bringing them back, Harriet. We've got a great question here from Nikki O'Donnell. What's next, Harriet?
It's already started.
Wonderful.
I mean, basically, I'm trying to kill off Brexit wear. There's one piece I would like to do. Unfortunately, I think it would be probably quite obscure and unpopular, but I might yet do it. But but in terms of my next project, I'm taking it all on. It's been lovely hearing Kevin talking about people being aware of sustainability in clay practice. So I'm going back to hand building, and I'm making sort of a novel on clay surfaces and beyond, asking about sustainability of clay and clay work. And I know that's a terrible thing to be talking about at the BCB, but what I understand is that we all have to reduce our expectations, our material expectations in life by 90%. Now, you may reserve that 10% for clay, and that's fine by me, but my project is going to be exploring the future of our material expectations in life. It's all based on stuff I saw at PMAG. So, again, thank you to Stoke for that amazing inspiration there. And it's all based on 18th century ceramics patterns again. And it will be my last clay work because personally, I can't make the room for that. And it breaks my heart when I see an open face mine. And I think about the rare earth minerals that are being dug up all over the world to, make something look good. Apologies, but yeah, that's just my opinion.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, Harriet, and it's absolutely valid. It's so interesting to hear your perspective and just to hear back about this incredible journey that you've had with Brexit wear. Oh my days. Thank you so much for being so open and honest about everything. It's really, it's been really refreshing and wonderful to hear.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Harriet. So that brings us right up to 8. And this will be an opportunity for questions and answers. So I'll bring us back together. I'll take up the spotlight there, and I'll bring you together in gallery mode for me, and then I can see everybody. So yeah, if there is any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll perhaps start with the questions which Nancy had shared earlier. It would be lovely to pose these to the to Kevin, Nancy and Harriet as well, if you would like to answer them. I'll pop them in the chat and then I'll share them out loud. Oh yeah, Nikki O'Donnell just shared, I think, the question of sustainability and how much more stuff in the world needs is very interesting. Absolutely, I absolutely agree. It'll be a wonderful project to see the result of, Harriet, whenever it comes to be. And so the first question to get us started, what obstacles or barriers are stopping you from doing what you want to do? Kevin, Nancy or Harriet, have you ever had that experience, and have you overcome it in the past in your practice, if anything?
Every day. No, I'm not trained in ceramics, I'm not trained in art. Every action I take is a lot of hard work, and unless I do it, I won't do it. So the action I
just do it.
Yeah, and when I take something out of the mold and it's all wrong, it collapses or whatever, I have to make a note of what I did wrong and start again.
For me, it's usually something like bureaucracy. And, I've spent most of my life trying to help people make pots and help them make pots better. And I have sought funding from all sorts of avenues to enable me to help younger makers learn the skills. And unfortunately, there is an inordinate amount of money to teach people how to make pots who are absolutely not interested in making pots. But if you want money to help people who are interested, then it's not there. And that really is the origin of Clay College, because we thought, as an offshoot of Dr. Potter, that the only way that we were going to do this was to do it ourselves. And we did this without any government funding or help from anybody else. It was basically the ceramic community itself and the ceramic suppliers and all the friends and contacts that I have within Stoke that enabled us to do this. But it seems crazy to me that there are people out there who want to learn the skills, but there's no financial help for them. But if it's for people who are not interested, I've been offered inordinate amount of financial assistance, but it's usually to do with massaging the doll figures, and I'm not interested in that. I want to pass skills on to people who are interested in learning skills, not to help the government to take people off the street and make it appear that they're getting something. I find it most objectionable to see the amount of money that goes into sort of training schemes that really actually don't deliver anything.
What about you all, and who have joined us this evening? Feel free to share, either take yourself off mute or feel free to share in the chat the obstacles or barriers that might be stopping you in doing what you want to do. Nancy, is this a mean question to ask you?
Well, I mean, Kevin touched on a few things. I mean, for me, workspace, I'm working from home. I'm actually working from my kitchen. You know, I would love a proper functioning studio. It's really hard to make work in your home. But, you know, as he said, it really keeps, I could never afford to pay for a studio space. It's far too unstable for me during these times. So that's how I managed to get by. But even that's not easy, you know. So yeah, that's my biggest hurdle. And he also touched on the physicality of working with clay. It's a very physical process to do all the clay processing yourself, and all the moving and packing, and just the techniques can be physical too. So it's really important to take care of your body, I think, for the sort of longevity of your career. What else?
Yeah, the abuse of the body certainly comes back to haunt you in latter years. As a man of 66, I pay testament to that. You know, every morning are aches and pains, and probably most of those are associated with you know, mauling clay for 50 years.
Yeah, definitely.
The next question that was shared is there something that you dream of that you're afraid to reach for, and why? For everybody who's joining us this evening, is there anything that you discussed in your groups that you'd be willing to share wider? No problem. It's also yeah, quite a personal question in many ways. So I'd understand if you didn't feel comfortable sharing, but if you do, please feel free to unmute yourself and share it, or drop it in the chat. It sounds like for each of you, Nancy, Harriet and Kevin, you've each been really courageous and really reaching out and really striving to do the things that you want to do. Do you feel that you've always strove towards the things that you've dreamed of?
I think I mean a lot of what I do, and how I came to this all sort of goes back to I suppose being dyslexic, and you know, in the 60s it was extremely difficult to, you know, because there's no computers, no calculators and things like that, and I've always had this desire to make things, even from a small child, and that's, you know, been my saving grace really, is the opportunity, understanding parents, and being able to facilitate, you know, going to art school at the age of 15 and being able to do the things that I wanted to do without the sort of thought that, you know, I had to go out and get a proper job.
That is marvelous. I mean, for me, it was the opposite. You know, I was always making. I was always a scholar of art and going to museums and, you know, absorbing it.
Yeah.
But no one ever said to me, I think I was slightly a victim of feminism. People were saying women can do, you know, they can reach great heights. Okay. And I'm not sure that anyone around me thought that making was a great height. So, you know, I went in and I sort of really whacked it. You know, I got a first from Oxford in science, but it was in science. And I went off and I did a PhD and this and that, but it was never, people around me, no one guided me to say, is this what you want to be doing?
Well, I think it was quite strange because all my brothers are academic. My elder brother is a PhD in educational child psychology. My younger brother is an engineer. My eldest brother, who's no longer with us, was an architect. But my parents were, you know, came through the Second World War. And my father was in the RAF and he was prisoner of war in Stella Glove 3. And after the war, I think they saw that, you know, their children would have the opportunity, and as long as you weren't taking the mickey, we will back you all the way to do whatever you want. But obviously for me, having academic brothers and fairly academic parents, to be the dyslexic one, but, you know, art was my savior in a way, and the understanding of parents who were willing to let their son sort of go off to art school at 15, you know. And I know many of my friends would say, you don't know how lucky you are, you know, I've got to go out and get a proper job. Or, you know, when I taught in universities, I've sat with, you know, adults in their 50s and 60s, you know, interviewing them for a place at university in tears and saying, you don't understand what this means to me. I was not allowed to go into the arts. I had to go and do such and such a thing. And, you know, the jobs that these people have were absolutely amazing. Surgeons, paleontologists, you know, captains of industry. And they'd spent the last 40 years doing something they absolutely hated, and they'd had to wait till they nearly retired before they could come and make some pots or make some glass, you know. And I constantly think how bloody lucky I've been able to do pretty well what I wanted to do since the age of 15, you know, and that's in many ways why I'm so passionate about passing on the knowledge and trying to facilitate that for other people, you know. And so, you know, if I've got the opportunity to pass on some skill, you know, I'm the sum total and product of everybody who I've ever worked with and alongside, who's been incredibly generous with their help and understanding and passing on. And, you know, that's what I want to do for other people. So if I can do that, then that's, you know, that's great. As long as the body holds out.
Harriet, I'd love to know how you came to working creatively, having come from a different career.
I always was working creatively. So in New York, when I went out to do a master's at Columbia University. In fact, I went out to do my PhD there in neurobiology. But, you know, every Saturday I was out at the Met the whole day, just sort of sketching and thinking and making, actually. I mean, I've got lots of pots and things that I made at that time. Some of them made out of air dry clay, you know, but I was always making, not for public consumption, but I was myself always making. So I've got quite my family's quite broad in its spanning of art and science. My great grandmother was an artist who was also trained as a scientist, quite rare at her day. My grandfather was a scientist and artist. So it's never really been a conflict to me. I just think that both disciplines enhance the other. I wish we could bring them together more, and I regret.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you know, to a degree, arts subjects should be more involved with academia and people who, you know, studying the hard sciences or whatever, that an understanding that, you know, they are equal but different. You know, I've had many students who've you know, had PhDs in hard sciences, and they come to me and they say, Kevin, since studying ceramics and glass, I've realized this is the most difficult thing I've ever done. And I say, why is that? And they say, for the first time in my life, I have to think for myself, and there's no right and wrong answer, you know, and that's what they find difficult, is because you have to find yourself and you have to find your direction, and there's nobody there to tell you this is the right or wrong answer.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a really powerful phrase, Kevin. There's no right or wrong answer. And that is scary, Nancy, to answer your question, you know, coping with the fact that there's no tick, there's no first class honours degree, you know, there's no right or wrong answer.
No guarantee, you know, everything's always constantly changing, you know, so as soon as you think you've got to a comfortable level, something else changes, your clay changes, or, you know, the market changes, or
very, very interesting. I had a student, he extremely wealthy man, owned a massive construction company, and he lived in a mansion on the banks of the Thames at Henley, and used to come to college in his Bentley, and he owned a massive property out in Wales as well. And when he graduated from the ceramics and glass course, he was 70 years old. And he just before graduation, he came up to me and he said, Kevin, he said, I've been walking around for 65 years with my eyes closed, and this course has made me see things I've never seen before. And it was just that awareness. And this guy was fun. His drawings were, in fact, his final work were his sketches that he did while he was on holiday in France. And we made them into transfers and put them onto massive press molded dishes. And it sort of made you aware that really people sort of walk around looking at the floor. They don't actually look at what's around them. And I think that's what the sort of art education does for you. It makes you actually look around and see what's about, and then that feeds back into the work. Ted was an inspiration. He was the first into college. He'd walk into the studio at 8:30 in the morning, and Ted was there on the wheel, and he was still there at sort of 8 and 9 o'clock at night, whereas the other students were still nursing a headache from the night before, you know. But he understood the value and the fact that, you know, he'd got a limited amount of time, and he needed to put in whatever he could while he could.
I've got one of Nancy's final questions, which I think would be a lovely way to finish today, because it's 8:15, and I would love to hear from everybody. Please put it in the chat or share out loud. The question is, what is the most joyful part of your practice? Harriet, could we start with you?
Yeah, just, you know, being on my own and making. I just love it. I just love it. You know, just sitting and painting. I've recently fired some pieces where I'd done some underglaze painting, and they were vertical, and the underglaze ran, because I'm asking a lot of those underglaze colours that there's high resolution, and they ran, and so that was it. But I've just sat down recently with some on-glaze paint, and I've just been tracing, just even the joy of just tracing over what I'd previously drawn and preparing it for another firing. It's just been lovely. It's well, I'm sure Nancy knows about this, but very, very centering to me. It's a lovely thing to do. Great joy.
Nancy, what about you?
Oh, I think it would have to be stoking my kiln by myself. Because it's like, for me, it's unlike anything else. It just takes your entire focus, you know, you can't think about all the other worries you have. It's sort of almost a bit hypnotic. I mean, it sounds a bit airy-fairy, but so yeah, just to be able to focus, you know, totally on one thing, that's just a very special moment for me.
Thank you. Kevin, what about you?
It might sound a bit self-indulgent, but I think the one thing I really miss is sitting in the workshop on the wheel on my own, listening to Radio 4.
Sounds like a dream, Kevin.
I just spend so much time talking and teaching and all the different things I'm involved in. That would be nice to just get back. That's why I'm trying to sort of wind down and take a bit of time out and maybe make some pots for myself again.
Well, that's lovely. My colleague Helen Felsey's co-hosting with me today. Helen, what would yours be? The most joyful part of your practice?
Well, I have to be honest, and I'd say the two things came to mind. One is actually the opposite. It's people. It's working with people and the connection you feel, and actually what you said, Kevin, earlier about that you're a product of all of the people who, you know, who support you. That really kind of, you know, struck a chord with me. But also, you know, equally listening, you know, to Harriet and Nancy talk about that kind of quiet moment in practice, right? You know, from being a child, I think sitting and drawing quietly was the most kind of, you know, restful activity. So I think there's two sort of sides to the coin for me.
Thanks so much, Helen. We've got some really lovely comments here. Laura Plant, exploring and being creative. I never want to stand still and stop learning and exploring. Dawn Foster, constantly learning. Nikki O'Donnell, both sharing ideas with colleagues and sitting alone at a table with a bit of clay and pressing stuff into it. Jez Anderson and Popolini. Ours, like Nancy, is wood firing and the pottery community. Sarah Fraser, colleague of mine, at BCB, getting in the flow of making on my own, but also sharing the joy of the material with people. Dorit Ben Dixon, just sharing some thanks, it's lovely. We've got one from Valerie, joyful is sharing and showing my work in the flesh with people. Thank everybody, thank you all so much for sharing those with us. And yeah, thank you to our speakers this evening, Harriet, Nancy and Kevin. It has been a real joy. It has been my joy to have you here joining us. Yeah, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you all so much for putting so much energy and thought into what you would share with us this evening. We're really grateful for it.
Oh, thank you.
Our pleasure. Come see us at Clay College. Come to the gallery.
Oh, wonderful. Well, there we are. We've come to the end of our session. Thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. It's been really lovely to have you here. And yeah, this comes to the end of our session. The next one we have coming up is the week after next. Let me get the date. Week 2 is on the 30th of September. Same time, 6 to 8, 20 past 8, including the questions and answers. And on week 2, we have artist and BCB community program manager Joanne Mills and service manager at Stoke Recovery Service Vicky Lomas. We've got artist and initiator of Mudbelly Ceramics Phoebe Collins James. We've got artist, researcher and podcaster Eva Masterman, together with lecturer, practice-based researcher and learning designer Dina Baji. It is a jam-packed session and I hope you'll join us for it. I'll follow up whenever I get back to you with some notes and such with the other weeks if you're interested in joining us. But yes, thank you so much everybody for being here. Yeah. And have a lovely rest of your evening and night, because I'll be going to bed soon myself. Cheerio everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
See you later. Bye.